The wind howled like a living thing, battering the windshield with icy fists. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles pale, as the snowstorm thickened around him. The truck's wipers fought a losing battle, barely clearing enough to see the winding road ahead. Visibility was near zero, the headlights carving out only a dim tunnel through the blizzard. Trees blurred into shapes, fences disappeared into white, and the world outside felt ghostly, like a forgotten dream. He hadn't meant to stay this late. But the overtime had been too tempting. Another hour meant a few more bucks to pay off the overdue bills piling on his kitchen counter. Now, miles from town, in the belly of the storm, it felt like he was the only soul left on the planet. The radio crackled static, offering no comfort, just a reminder of how cut off he was. Alone, cold, tired. But something about tonight felt different, charged. Inside the cab, the heater wheezed, blowing lukewarm air that couldn't chase away the chill in Daniel's bones. He leaned forward, resting one hand on the dashboard as fatigue clawed at his eyes. His jaw tightened, not just from the cold, but from everything weighing him down. 12-hour shifts, empty nights. The silence of a house that once echoed with laughter. The divorce papers still sat unopened on the kitchen table. He hadn't had the courage to read them yet. What was the point? His world had already unraveled. Now, every mile he drove felt like running from the echoes of a life that had once mattered. The truck rolled through a sleeping stretch of countryside. Homes stood with dark windows, some flickering faint Christmas lights, leftover memories of warmth that Daniel couldn't bring himself to care about. Each porch, each chimney, whispered stories of families huddled inside, safe and whole. Daniel didn't slow down. He hadn't spoken to his neighbors in weeks. Not since Lisa left. Not since he'd stopped answering calls or pretending to be okay. The loneliness wasn't loud anymore. It was quiet. Familiar. Like a second skin, he was surviving, not living. And on nights like this, with snow thick on the road and silence thick in his chest, he barely noticed the difference. Then, movement. A flash of dark against the whiteout. Something darted into the road, low and fast. Whoa! Daniel slammed his foot on the brakes. The truck jerked violently, tires squealing as they skated across the slick road. His heart leapt into his throat, his eyes fixed ahead, bracing for impact. But nothing. No thud, no crash. The headlights lit up the swirling snow, revealing only the empty road ahead and a snow-covered ditch just beyond. His chest rose and fell with short, sharp breaths. What the hell was that? His fingers trembled slightly as he gripped the wheel again. A deer, a coyote. Something about the movement had felt different, desperate, smaller. He wasn't sure, but his pulse thumped in his ears like a warning. The truck groaned as it came to a halt, tires grinding softly on the icy edge of the road. Daniel stared into the ditch, squinting. Something had been there. He was sure of it. The snow was thick, but he could make out a subtle disturbance. Tracks, maybe, or a shadow where the powder had been flattened. And suddenly, against the numbness that usually coated his chest like armor, he felt something stir. A flicker, concern, a sharp tug in the gut. He didn't know why it mattered, but it did, more than it should, and it wasn't letting go. Daniel sat still, the engine idling low beneath him. Every logical thought told him to keep going, get home, warm up, forget it. But his hand moved anyway, slowly. Quietly. He turned the wheel. The truck groaned as he reversed, headlights cutting through the snow like twin lighthouses. His breath fogged the window as he scanned the ditch, eyes darting for movement. Still nothing. But he knew. Something had crossed that road, and it wasn't just an animal. It felt like a message, a moment waiting to be answered. "This is crazy," he muttered under his breath. Yet, still, he rolled down the window slightly, letting in the bitter wind, straining to hear something. Anything. Then, faintly, he did. A soft, almost imperceptible whimper in the distance. The wipers thudded against the windshield, barely keeping pace with the blizzard outside. Visibility was down to yards, maybe less. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter, leaning forward, his breath fogging the glass despite the heat on full blast. The road, once familiar, was now a maze of white streaks and ghostly outlines. Then, something shifted in the blur. Just off the edge of the road, near a drift shaped like a crumpled blanket, was movement. Barely there, like a flicker of life trying not to be lost. Daniel hit the brakes, his truck skidding slightly before coming to a stop. He blinked, unsure if it was a trick of the storm. But no. There it was again, a shiver, a tremble. Something small, motionless, yet not quite still. His gut clenched. It wasn't a branch or scrap of tarp. It was alive, and it was dying out there. The wind slammed into him like a wall of knives as he opened the door, his coat flapping behind him. Snow whipped across his face, stinging his cheeks, but he barely noticed. His boots crunched on the ice-slicked gravel as he moved, head down, eyes locked on the shadow in the snow. Each step felt heavier, not from the storm, but from the pull in his chest. It wasn't fear, it was something deeper, a tug, almost familiar, buried under years of silence and solitude. "Please, don't be too late," he muttered to no one, and kept walking. The wind dropped for just a moment as he knelt beside it. There, curled like a wilted leaf, lay a German Shepherd puppy. Its fur, a mix of snow and ash gray, was clumped with ice. One ear flopped limply while the other twitched ever so slightly. Its eyes, wide, glassy, haunted, didn't move. They only stared. Not at him. Through him. As if fear had frozen the little soul, solid, and only its body remained. Daniel reached out, careful, like approaching a fragile sculpture. The pup didn't flinch, didn't whimper. That silence was the loudest thing he'd heard in years. His breath caught. He should have felt helpless. But instead, something cracked open inside him. The wind howled louder now, but Daniel didn't notice. His hands moved before his mind caught up. He shrugged off his flannel jacket, worn, torn at one elbow, but warm, and cradled the pup inside it like it was the most natural thing he'd ever done. He felt the shiver through the fabric. Not a struggle, just desperation. "I got you," he whispered, holding the bundle tight to his chest. There were 100 questions screaming in his head. Where did it come from? Was it alone? Would it make it? But only one answer mattered right now. It was his. The door slammed behind him with a thud that echoed in the stillness of the cabin. The warmth hit him like a wave, and for the first time in hours he exhaled. He moved quickly. Towels, the old basket from the shed, the heater turned toward the living room floor. Daniel placed the pup down gently, wrapping it like a newborn. Its breath was shallow, but steady. He didn't know much about dogs anymore, but he knew the fight wasn't over yet. He sat beside it, knees drawn to his chest, eyes never leaving the little body in the nest of towels. The bowl of water trembled slightly as he placed it near the basket, his fingers still trembling from the cold, or maybe something else. He should have walked away, let the pup rest. Turned the radio back on. Gone back to the quiet life he'd built like a fortress. But he didn't. Instead, he sat there, waiting, not just for the puppy to move, but for something inside him to do the same. The flames in the fireplace danced, and with them came a flicker of memory, unbidden, sharp, and raw. Daniel, no older than 12, sat beneath a maple tree, arms wrapped around a muddy, grinning mutt named Buddy. The dog licked his cheek as he laughed, the kind of laughter that came easy back then, pure, untouched by loss. Then the memory twisted. Buddy's empty collar, the vet's quiet voice, the hole in the backyard Daniel had helped dig, his tears soaking the fresh dirt. He'd sworn never again. No more dogs, no more loss, no more pain. But as the fire cracked and the wind howled outside, the silence in the room held something else. Hope and fear tangled together. The tiniest sound broke the silence, a breath, a rustle. Daniel turned. The pup's eyes blinked slowly. Its small body trembled as it pushed itself upright, unsteady and unsure. Then, with a fragile kind of courage, it leaned forward. Its cold, damp nose brushed against his hand. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Because in that moment, quiet, simple, almost nothing, the wall inside him cracked. A touch, a choice, a beginning. And Daniel, for the first time in years, felt the faint warmth of connection return. Shadow's paw still trembled slightly when it hit the cold morning dirt, but the limp was fainter than the day before. Daniel stood at the porch with his coffee, arms crossed, trying not to smile, but failing. The sight of the dog pushing forward, despite pain, struck a quiet chord in him. He hadn't realized he was watching Shadow this closely. But each hesitant step the dog took toward recovery made Daniel feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He whispered under his breath, "You're tougher than you look, kid." And though the pup didn't respond, Daniel swore the dog held his gaze just a second longer that morning, like he'd heard him. Daniel stood at the checkout line, staring at the cart full of things he never thought he'd be buying. 3 brands of kibble, 2 squeaky toys, a soft blanket, and a bag of liver treats. "New dog?" the cashier asked. "Something like that," Daniel replied, his voice lower than usual. Back home, he tossed the chew toy toward the porch. Shadow hesitated for a moment, then patted over and gave it a cautious sniff. When his paw nudged it and the toy squeaked, the dog jumped back, startled. Daniel chuckled, the sound foreign even to his own ears. Something about this routine, shopping for someone other than himself, was pulling him out of his own silence. Bit by bit, the old walls he'd built around his heart began to crack. A week later, Daniel knelt in the dirt beside the newly built doghouse. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, insulated, elevated, and lined with straw. He stepped back, satisfied, then looked down at the pup sitting quietly beside him. "You follow me around like a shadow," Daniel said softly. "Guess that's what I'll call you." The dog's ears perked, just a little. Daniel smiled. "Shadow it is." That night, Shadow curled into his new house, and Daniel stood on the porch longer than usual, just watching. It felt like something had shifted, like the silence wasn't so empty anymore. Just past midnight, the first sound came, barely audible over the wind. A soft, broken whimper. Daniel sat up, another whine, then a yelp, sharp and full of something Daniel recognized too well. Fear. He stepped outside barefoot, heart thudding. Shadow thrashed lightly inside the doghouse, eyes closed, body twitching, caught in a dream that hadn't ended for him yet. Daniel crouched beside him, whispering his name. "Shadow." "It's all right. You're home." The dog startled awake, wide-eyed, then shrank into the corner. But Daniel didn't move. He just stayed there, present, patient, until the trembling stopped. A week later, the routine repeated. 2:07 a.m. Daniel was already up, sitting by Shadow's side before the whimpering began. This time, he gently rested a hand on the dog's back. Shadow flinched, then stilled. "You're safe now," Daniel murmured. The words came out rough, like they'd been buried for years, but saying them, to Shadow, to himself, felt like a kind of healing neither of them had dared to ask for. The dog slowly leaned into him, head brushing against Daniel's knee. A silent thank you. And for once, Daniel didn't pull away. He didn't talk about his wife or the accident. Most people stopped asking years ago. But sometimes when he looked at Shadow, Daniel saw a reflection of his own pain. The flinching, the hesitation, the fear of getting close again. He hadn't meant to care. He told himself he was just helping a dog through a storm. But now Shadow was here, curling up by the fire, waiting for him at the door, and Daniel could feel the fear creeping in. What if I lose him too? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. But the fear stayed. They were walking the trail by the river when it happened. A man, stranger, drunk maybe, came out of nowhere, shouting angrily about dogs off leash, jabbing a finger too close to Daniel's chest. Before Daniel could respond, Shadow moved. He stepped in front of Daniel, growling, a low, steady sound that made the stranger take a step back. Daniel froze. It was the first time Shadow had shown anything like aggression. But it wasn't fear, it was protection. And that moment, standing behind a dog who once couldn't walk straight, Daniel felt something rush through him, like being seen and shielded all at once. Later that night, Daniel sat on the porch steps, Shadow lying beside him. He reached down, brushing the dog's fur behind the ear. "That wasn't just about me, was it?" he said quietly. Shadow looked up, eyes steady. "You trust me now." The realization settled deep into Daniel's chest. Shadow hadn't just guarded him, he'd chosen him. And for the first time in years, Daniel let the warmth of that truth in. He wasn't just saving a dog anymore. They were saving each other. Morning became a ritual. Daniel laced his boots just before sunrise. Shadow would already be at the door, tail thumping, ready. They ran the trail along the ridge, where the golden light broke through trees and the air smelled of pine and frost. There was no leash, no need, just the rhythm of two sets of footsteps, breathing in sync, chasing something unseen, but healing all the same. With each mile, the weight on Daniel's shoulders lightened. They weren't running from the past, they were running toward something. Every day, Daniel came home to the same sight. Shadow sitting at the door, ears perked, tail wagging before the truck even pulled into the driveway. It never failed. Daniel would climb out, grin spreading across his face before he could stop it. Some days, Shadow would nudge a ball toward him. Other days, he'd just rest his head against Daniel's leg, silent but certain. The house didn't feel cold anymore. It felt lived in, warm, whole, and Daniel realized this wasn't just where Shadow belonged. It was where he belonged too. The first time it happened, it was barely a whisper. "I still think about her," he said one night, looking out at the stars. Shadow lay at his feet, ears twitching slightly. Daniel chuckled dryly. "She loved dogs, you know. Said we'd get one when things slowed down." The words kept coming. About the accident, the guilt, the way silence had wrapped itself around him like armor. Shadow didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He just stayed. And that was more than enough. Sometimes Daniel would pause mid-sentence, unsure if he was making any sense. Then he'd look down, and there'd be Shadow, watching him with eyes so steady, so full of something like understanding, that the lump in Daniel's throat would rise all over again. "You get it, don't you?" Daniel would whisper, and maybe he did, because healing doesn't always come in words. Sometimes it comes in silence, in steady eyes, in the quiet weight of a dog's head on your knee. And in that silence, Daniel found a kind of peace he never thought possible. Daniel had just finished a long day at work when he heard the knock. It was loud, abrupt, like a signal of trouble. His heart skipped, the weight of the day hanging heavily on him, but nothing could prepare him for what would come next. As he opened the door, his breath caught in his throat. A man stood there, eyes cold, his features hardened by time, and a jagged scar that ran down his cheek, marking him like a sign of violence. The man spoke with a voice that was rough, as though it hadn't been used kindly. "I'm here for Shadow. He's mine," he said flatly. Daniel blinked, disoriented. Shadow, his loyal companion, who had only ever known kindness here in this home, was now the center of a confrontation he hadn't expected. The suddenness of the man's presence and claim froze Daniel for a second, his mind racing for answers. The moment Daniel stepped back to let the man into the hallway, Shadow came into view, standing behind Daniel. The dog's eyes were wide with fear, his body trembling. Shadow's ears were pinned back, his tail tucked between his legs, and he took an instinctive step away from the man, a soft whimper escaping his throat. Daniel glanced down at his furry friend, his heart aching. It was as if the dog could sense the danger, the fear this man brought. Shadow had always been the brave one, the protector, but now he was the one needing protection. The man advanced, his gaze unwavering as he looked down at Shadow, who now cowered behind Daniel's legs. "He's mine," the man repeated, more forcefully this time. But the dog shrank back even further, a clear sign that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something far worse. Daniel's mind raced. Flashbacks of Shadow's flinching whenever someone moved too quickly, the way he'd freeze at loud noises. Pieces of a disturbing puzzle began to fall into place. The healed scars on Shadow's body, ones that Daniel had assumed were the result of rough play or previous neglect, now seemed to tell a darker story. He remembered the way Shadow would often shrink away from certain gestures, as if afraid of something far worse than any cold or harsh word. Could this man be the one responsible for the trauma Shadow had endured? Daniel felt the sharp sting of anger mixed with confusion, but most of all, he felt an overwhelming need to protect the dog he had come to love like family. Shadow had been through too much already. Daniel wasn't about to let anyone hurt him again. The man's voice cut through the silence. "I have photos. I have proof," he said, pulling out his phone, showing Daniel a series of grainy images. Each one seemed like nothing more than random pictures, nothing solid to back up his claim. The more the man spoke, the more Daniel felt the tension grow. But there was one thing that stayed true. He had no proof that Shadow belonged to him. There was no documentation, no formal adoption papers, just a deep connection that couldn't be explained by anything other than love. Despite the man's demands and his threatening tone, Daniel stood silent, panic bubbling inside him. He didn't need to prove anything. The bond he shared with Shadow was enough. But he was afraid that the legal system, the world of rules and paperwork, wouldn't see it that way. His heart pounding in his chest, Daniel took a deep breath. "I'm not giving him up," he said, his voice firm but shaky. "Shadow is mine. I've taken care of him. I'm the one who's been there for him." The man didn't say anything at first. He just stared at Daniel with a cold, calculating look. For a moment, the world felt still, the air thick with tension. Then the man spoke again, his voice dripping with venom. "We'll see about that." Daniel could feel his heart race faster. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew that there was no turning back. He would fight for Shadow, no matter the cost. Just as the man was about to turn and leave, the door swung open behind them. A woman stood there, her eyes wide with concern, but her voice was calm, almost knowing. "I've seen that dog before." She stepped inside, her gaze locking onto the man, and the man's face shifted, like he'd been caught. She continued, "I volunteer at the shelter. Shadow, his real name is Shadow, was brought in a few months ago, bruised and frightened. His behavior, it matches the abuse reports we filed with Animal Services. You were listed in the reports." The man's eyes flashed with anger, but he said nothing. He couldn't deny the truth now. The woman, a shelter volunteer named Lisa, had just become a witness to the past Daniel had only started to uncover. With a scowl, the man turned on his heel and stormed out of the apartment. "You haven't seen the last of me," he spat. "I'll take you to court. You'll regret this." Daniel watched as the man disappeared, a sense of dread sinking into his bones. As the door slammed shut behind him, Lisa turned to Daniel, her face softening. "You did the right thing," she said. "But he's not going to give up that easily. Prepare yourself for a fight." Daniel nodded slowly, his mind already spiraling into the unknown future that awaited him. He wasn't prepared for a legal battle, but he wasn't going to back down. Shadow had come into his life for a reason, and there was no way he was letting go now. Days passed, and the legal battle began to unfold. Daniel sat anxiously in the courtroom, his gaze locked on the door, waiting for the moment when Shadow would be forced to choose. The man's lawyer had claimed ownership, showing the court the photos, his supposed history with the dog, and all the empty words that meant nothing compared to what Daniel knew to be true. When the moment came, the courtroom fell silent. Both men stood, calling to Shadow. The moment Daniel stepped back to let the man into the hallway, Shadow came into view, standing behind Daniel. The dog's eyes were wide with fear, his body trembling. Shadow's ears were pinned back, his tail tucked between his legs, and he took an instinctive step away from the man, a soft whimper escaping his throat. Daniel glanced down at his furry friend, his heart aching. It was as if the dog could sense the danger, the fear this man brought. Shadow had always been the brave one, the protector, but now he was the one needing protection. The man advanced, his gaze unwavering as he looked down at Shadow, who now cowered behind Daniel's legs. "He's mine," the man repeated, more forcefully this time. But the dog shrank back even further, a clear sign that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something far worse. Daniel's mind raced. Flashbacks of Shadow's flinching whenever someone moved too quickly, the way he'd freeze at loud noises. Pieces of a disturbing puzzle began to fall into place. The healed scars on Shadow's body, ones that Daniel had assumed were the result of rough play or previous neglect, now seemed to tell a darker story. He remembered the way Shadow would often shrink away from certain gestures, as if afraid of something far worse than any cold or harsh word. Could this man be the one responsible for the trauma Shadow had endured? Daniel felt the sharp sting of anger mixed with confusion, but most of all, he felt an overwhelming need to protect the dog he had come to love like family. Shadow had been through too much already. Daniel wasn't about to let anyone hurt him again. The man's voice cut through the silence. "I have photos, I have proof," he said, pulling out his phone, showing Daniel a series of grainy images. Each one seemed like nothing more than random pictures, nothing solid to back up his claim. The more the man spoke, the more Daniel felt the tension grow. But there was one thing that stayed true. He had no proof that Shadow belonged to him. There was no documentation, no formal adoption papers, just a deep connection that couldn't be explained by anything other than love. Despite the man's demands and his threatening tone, Daniel stood silent, panic bubbling inside him. He didn't need to prove anything. The bond he shared with Shadow was enough. But he was afraid that the legal system, the world of rules and paperwork, wouldn't see it that way. His heart pounding in his chest, Daniel took a deep breath. "I'm not giving him up," he said, his voice firm but shaky. "Shadow is mine. I've taken care of him. I'm the one who's been there for him." The man didn't say anything at first. He just stared at Daniel with a cold, calculating look. For a moment, the world felt still, the air thick with tension. Then the man spoke again, his voice dripping with venom. "We'll see about that." Daniel could feel his heart race faster. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew that there was no turning back. He would fight for Shadow, no matter the cost. Just as the man was about to turn and leave, the door swung open behind them. A woman stood there, her eyes wide with concern, but her voice was calm, almost knowing. "I've seen that dog before." She stepped inside, her gaze locking onto the man, and the man's face shifted, like he'd been caught. She continued, "I volunteer at the shelter. Shadow, his real name is Shadow, was brought in a few months ago, bruised and frightened. His behavior, it matches the abuse reports we filed with Animal Services. You were listed in the reports." The man's eyes flashed with anger, but he said nothing. He couldn't deny the truth now. The woman, a shelter volunteer named Lisa, had just become a witness to the past Daniel had only started to uncover. With a scowl, the man turned on his heel and stormed out of the apartment. "You haven't seen the last of me," he spat. "I'll take you to court. You'll regret this." Daniel watched as the man disappeared, a sense of dread sinking into his bones. As the door slammed shut behind him, Lisa turned to Daniel, her face softening. "You did the right thing," she said. "But he's not going to give up that easily. Prepare yourself for a fight." Daniel nodded slowly, his mind already spiraling into the unknown future that awaited him. He wasn't prepared for a legal battle, but he wasn't going to back down. Shadow had come into his life for a reason, and there was no way he was letting go now. Days passed, and the legal battle began to unfold. Daniel sat anxiously in the courtroom, his gaze locked on the door, waiting for the moment when Shadow would be forced to choose. The man's lawyer had claimed ownership, showing the court the photos, his supposed history with the dog, and all the empty words that meant nothing compared to what Daniel knew to be true. When the moment came, the courtroom fell silent. Both men stood, calling to Shadow. The dog, as if understanding the gravity of the moment, looked between them, his eyes filled with confusion. Then slowly, he limped toward Daniel, his tail low, and pressed his head against Daniel's lap. A wave of relief washed over Daniel, and he leaned down, stroking Shadow's fur, his heart swelling with a love he couldn't put into words. The dog had made his choice, and it was one that only true companionship could create. The judge, a woman whose eyes softened as she looked at Shadow, paused before making her decision. "The bond between this man and his dog speaks for itself," she said, her voice steady. "It is clear to me where Shadow's heart lies. Daniel, you are the one who has earned his trust and love." The room was silent as the judge made her ruling. "I rule in favor of Mr. Daniel, and Shadow will remain in his care." Daniel exhaled sharply, relief flooding him. Shadow's silent testimony had spoken louder than any words could. In that moment, Daniel knew that no matter what challenges life threw their way, the bond they shared would always be unbreakable. As the months passed, Shadow's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The timid, broken dog that had once trembled at every sound and cowered from every touch now stood proudly by Daniel's side, his tail wagging in exuberant arcs. The scars from his past remained, faint but visible, reminders of the suffering he had endured, but they were no longer his defining traits. His eyes, once clouded with fear and uncertainty, now sparkled with trust and warmth. Each day the bond between them grew stronger. Shadow would follow Daniel everywhere, whether to the shop, down the street, or just to the mailbox. The world that had once seemed so overwhelming to him was now filled with love, and it was Daniel who had opened the door to that new life. The slow, hesitant steps he had taken at first were replaced with joyful leaps, and soon Shadow had fully embraced his new identity as the heart of Daniel's life. No longer was he a shadow of the past. Now he was a vibrant, living creature full of hope. With Shadow at his side, Daniel found something he hadn't known he was missing, a sense of purpose. His passion for fixing things, for making the broken whole again, turned into a small auto repair business. At first, it was humble. A few repairs here and there, some odd jobs for the locals, but Daniel poured his heart into it and it showed. People began to notice, and soon his reputation grew. Shadow, of course, was never far away. He lay beside Daniel as the man worked, occasionally lifting his head to watch him turn wrenches, his tail tapping against the floor in quiet rhythm. There was a symbiosis between them. Daniel's hands were steady, while Shadow's presence grounded him. Shadow seemed to sense the rhythm of Daniel's life, and every time he looked at the dog, there was a silent understanding between them. They were both rebuilding. It didn't take long for the town to fall in love with Daniel and Shadow. The locals would stop by the shop, greeted not only by the sound of the grinder and the smell of motor oil, but also by the warm, friendly presence of Shadow. He would lean against the door as if waiting for the next visitor, and once they entered, Shadow would be there to greet them with his gentle, eager eyes and a wagging tail. Children who passed by on their way home from school would stop to pet him, their laughter ringing out as he sat quietly, letting them run their hands through his fur. Elderly customers, some who had known hardship themselves, would take a moment to chat with Daniel, and more often than not, they'd end up with Shadow resting at their feet, a soft and constant reminder of the kindness the world still had to offer. Daniel's honest work and Shadow's comforting presence became symbols of second chances, proof that even the most broken things could be mended. People began to look at Daniel not just as the mechanic down the street, but as a man who had found redemption in the most unlikely of places. Shadow, however, wasn't just Daniel's loyal companion. He became a part of the community in his own right. In the shop, he was the unofficial mascot, his soft eyes and quiet demeanor offering solace to everyone who came through the door. He knew how to comfort, how to listen, how to just be there. He had a special way with the kids, playful yet gentle, allowing them to pull on his fur or give him awkward hugs without ever flinching. He sat beside the elderly, his body leaning against theirs, as though to say, "You're not alone." And he was the quiet presence for those who came to Daniel's shop just to talk. The world had hardened them, but in Shadow's calm gaze, they found a brief respite. People would often joke that they came for the auto repairs but stayed for Shadow, and in a way, they were right. Shadow was more than just a dog. He was a source of light, reminding everyone who encountered him that there was still goodness in the world. Through his quiet actions, he healed far more than cars ever could. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the town, Daniel and Shadow would settle onto the porch of their small house. The rhythm of their evening was simple. No words needed to be spoken. Shadow would curl up beside Daniel's chair, resting his head on his paws, and the two of them would sit in silence as the day gently faded into night. The world seemed to pause in those moments, the noise of the day fading away, leaving only the quiet companionship between man and dog. Daniel would occasionally stroke Shadow's fur, his hand moving slowly, as though to reassure himself that this peace, this contentment, was real. In the quiet of those moments he could reflect on how far they had come, how much they had both healed, and for Shadow it was more than just a routine. It was a sacred ritual, a moment of rest after a long day of learning how to live again. They had both been broken in different ways, but together they had found something beautiful. The sunset was a reminder each evening that they were home. One evening, as the sky above them darkened into a blanket of stars, Daniel leaned down and whispered softly to Shadow, his voice barely above a breath, "You saved me too." It was a simple statement, but it held more weight than anything else he could have said. Daniel had been lost, grief-stricken, purposeless, haunted by his own past, and Shadow had been the catalyst for his healing. But now, as he stroked the soft fur beneath his hand, Daniel realized that Shadow had been saved by him, too. Together, they had been redeemed, each providing the other with the kind of love that healed wounds no one else could see. Shadow raised his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting Daniel's. There was no need for words. The deep bond between them spoke volumes, echoing in the silence that surrounded them. It wasn't just the dog who had found a home. It was Daniel as well. They had both come from places of hurt, but now they had each other. As Daniel sat there, feeling the steady rhythm of Shadow's breath beside him, he realized that this was a lifetime of healing. No longer were they two lost souls. They were a family, and together they would face whatever came their way, bound by a love stronger than anything that had come before. Daniel sat on the porch, his hand resting on Shadow's head as the dog lay beside him, eyes calm and trusting. He looked out into the distance, reflecting on the chaos of his life before the dog had arrived, before Shadow had transformed it all. In the stillness, Daniel smiled softly. Not all second chances walk on two legs, he thought. In his case, his second chance had four. Shadow, once a battered, scared animal, had become a constant presence in his life. A reminder that healing could come in the most unexpected forms. It was a strange thought, but one Daniel cherished. He had never imagined that a dog would become his anchor, his salvation. And yet, here they were, two beings who had saved each other. The days were no longer marked by the noise of struggle or heartache. Instead, Daniel and Shadow's lives had woven together in simple, quiet moments. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't some grand gesture. It was in the way Shadow's tail would thump against the floor when Daniel came home. The slow, steady rhythm of their long walks around the neighborhood, the scent of fresh grass mixing with the crisp evening air. It was in these quiet rituals that healing took root, unspoken but felt deeply. Every shared glance, every moment of peace. They were building something that neither had ever expected. Together, they had found something more powerful than words, a bond formed through silence and shared presence. At first, Shadow had been distant, unsure. He hadn't been the playful pup that Daniel might have imagined, but instead a wary, broken creature who didn't understand trust. But over time, as Daniel had whispered soft words and offered gentle hands, something had begun to shift. The transformation wasn't immediate. It was small steps, slow and deliberate, like a puzzle being pieced together one fragment at a time. Trust didn't come easily to either of them. Daniel had to prove to Shadow that he was safe, just as Shadow had to show Daniel that love wasn't always something you gave, but something that had to be earned day by day. One quiet evening, as they sat side by side on the porch, Daniel finally understood. It wasn't just him who had rescued Shadow. It was the other way around, too. Shadow had given him something he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of purpose, a reason to get up each day. When Daniel had taken Shadow in, he thought he was saving the dog. But as the days turned into months, he saw the truth. Shadow had saved him. He had reminded Daniel of the importance of resilience, of waking up every day with intent. He had reminded him that love and healing were possible, no matter the scars you carried. The final truth, the one Daniel held closest to his heart, was that when you open your heart, you open the door to healing. Shadow had entered his life at a time when he hadn't known how broken he truly was. But now, sitting there in the fading light of day, Daniel understood the depth of their bond. The wounded and the voiceless could teach you more about life than anything else ever could. They had both been given a second chance, at life, at love, and at healing. And as Shadow rested his head on Daniel's lap, Daniel knew that their journey wasn't just about rescuing each other. It was about opening themselves to something more profound than either of them had ever known.